Bravo, got a roll program. Stand by for mode 1, Charlie. Roger, Tower. Launch sequence engaged. We are go.
We began this conversation last week and looked at how, for many of us, our faith journey had a starting point, but unfortunately, the faith that we built early on didn't actually sustain as life hit. And that original starting point actually led to an ending point. And last week we talked about how do you restart the faith journey? What would the starting point be if you were to restart this? Whether we're doing it ourselves, engaging that journey ourselves, or whether we're helping those around us to be able to engage that journey. And we looked at this deeper, this more substantial starting point that God calls us to. The starting point really for the early church, which is this question: who is Jesus? And what will you do with the fact that he walked out of that tomb on Easter morning? And what we want to do as we walk through the next few weeks is we want to be able to answer that question, we want to be able to speak to that question, and we want to be able to build a faith that not only survives when life hits, but a faith that actually thrives when life hits. And in order to do that, we have to be honest about our starting point in terms of our faith journey, but we also have to be honest about something else. And today I want to sit with this a little bit because we also have to be honest about our own starting point. In other words, where we are and where we begin this spiritual journey from. Because the reality is, if you don't know where you are, it's very hard to get to where you want to go. And you can look at a map and know exactly where you want to go, but if you don't know where you're beginning, you're not going to be able to get there very effectively. And so I want to talk about, okay, where are we starting from as we engage this journey? To do that, we have to talk about something that, to be honest with you, is a little bit uncomfortable. We don't like the term that I want to be able to speak to you about. I'm guessing not many of you use this term. As a matter of fact, some of you have only heard this a couple times in your life, depending on the religious background that maybe you grew up in, or maybe your grandmother used this term with you, or if you're a part of Hoboken Grace, you've heard us try to define and help people understand this term as we've been on this journey together. But again, it's not typically part of our everyday conversation. The term is the term sin. And again, I'm betting that you probably didn't use this term as you moved through your week this past week. And when your coworker did something wrong, I'm betting that you didn't go to them and say, listen, we need to talk about your sin. I think that we need to go to HR about your sin. No, that's not how we speak to one another. And in a lot of ways, this term has almost become an antiquated term inside of our culture because we don't really use it anymore. And yet, I think that it's actually important that we talk about this. There are a lot of different reasons why we don't like it. This word sin comes with a weight to it, doesn't it? It comes with a connection to consequence. It's associated with this idea of condemnation. And so it's uncomfortable for us to talk about this word sin. We don't like it. There's another word that we like a lot more. It's the word mistake. And when we talk about what we've done wrong, we don't really like to use that word sin. No, I want to talk about how I made a mistake. And we frequently talk about how, I made a mistake. And even right now, if I were to ask you, and don't do it, don't raise your hands, but if I were to ask you to raise your hands if you've made a mistake in your life, or if you've made some mistakes in your life, everyone would immediately raise their hand. But if I were to replace that word with the word sin and ask you whether you've sinned in your life, I think eventually a lot of us would probably raise our hand, but especially the front row would be very careful. They'd probably turn around a little bit, like make sure, I'm not gonna be the only one raising my hand. Maybe you look for the worst person in the room and you're like, I'm not raising my hand if they don't raise their hand because they're screwed up. And I'm not, but we're far more likely to admit that we made a mistake. We talk often about the mistakes that we've made. But is the right word actually mistake? Is it actually mistakes that we make? I mean, a mistake is something that you make on a math test, when you forgot to show your work. But by the way, did you know that nowadays they don't ask students to show their work? My son came home and he's doing math and he wrote down the answer and I said, well, where's your work? He said, my teacher doesn't require me to show my work. I said, you live in this household, you will show your work. Totally unrelated to what we're talking about. But a mistake is something that you make when you don't know better. When you don't have sufficient information, or maybe you forgot. And so you were supposed to pick up milk on the way home and you forgot. I made a mistake. Is mistake actually the right word? I understand that we like to use this word mistake, but mistake, well, it implies that we didn't know better. But there's a couple things that I know about you and about me. One of them is this. Sometimes we make mistakes on purpose. And it's not that we didn't know better. As a matter of fact, we actually make the mistake on purpose. As a matter of fact, sometimes we actually plan to make a mistake. And you'll hear politicians talking about an affair that they've had, and they'll talk about, I made a mistake. Is mistake really the right word? I mean, you bought airplane tickets to make this mistake. You had a secret bank account set up to make this mistake. Is it really a mistake if you put that much planning into it? At what point in the planning does it move from no longer just being a mistake? What is it exactly that you call a premeditated mistake? Is it really a mistake? And some of us, we not only, not just some of us, all of us, not only do we plan mistakes, but we make that mistake intentionally over and over and over and over and over again. Some of us right now are planning a mistake. Some of us have a stash at home of planned mistakes. Is mistake the right word? I mean, honestly, what do you call a premeditated mistake? I know the word makes us feel better, but is it really the right word? Because a mistake is just something that you correct. I didn't know any better. I didn't have sufficient information, and so I made this mistake. And so now that I have the sufficient information, then I'll correct it. But here's one of the most frustrating things about life. Not only that we make the mistake over and over again, not only that we plan the mistake, not only that it's a premeditated mistake, but here's the other thing that I know about you. Not just that we make mistakes on purpose, but then also the other thing that I know about you, and I know this because it's true about me, as a matter of fact, it's true about all of us, is that while a mistake is something that's corrected, you and we can't actually correct ourselves. I can't actually correct myself. You can't actually correct you. And one of the most frustrating things about life is not only that you keep making the same mistake, but that you have worked incredibly hard to correct you and you can't. Some of you have read book after book after book after book, self-help book after self-help book after self-help book, trying to correct you, and yet you continue to lose your temper. You continue to lie to your spouse. You have actually paid people a tremendous amount of money to try to correct you. Your spouse has worked tirelessly to try to correct you. And yet, you keep making that mistake. Yet I keep making that mistake. You know what's even worse? Even when I'm not making the mistake, I want to make the mistake. Is mistake really the right word? What do you call a premeditated mistake? Knowing that it's going to hurt them, and yet you do it anyway. If we're going to build a faith that thrives, not just survives when life hits, but thrives when life hits. If we're going to reestablish our starting point when it comes to our faith journey, we also have to be honest about where we're starting from. And that means that we have to look ourselves in the mirror and acknowledge, I'm not just a mistaker. I'm a sinner. You see, a sinner is someone who knows better but does it anyway. And this is me. This is me. We have to be honest about where it is that we're starting from. And the reality that we don't just need a correction. The reality that even though we've worked and worked and worked to try to actually correct the mistake, no, there's more to it than that. And it's not just that I don't know better. No, I know better. But I do it anyway. And I know what it costs, and I know how it hurts, but I do it anyway. We have to be honest. I'm not just a mistaker. I'm a sinner. And as Jesus steps into our lives, he calls us to this reality over and over and over and over again. For those who are following him, he calls them to this reality time after time after time after time. Not just that they're making mistakes, but that they are sinners. Now, for those of us who are here, because of the way that we've seen this used, and because of the way that typically we've seen this word sin used, we think, well, the only reason that you would do that is so that you would make someone feel condemned. As a matter of fact, some of you right now are sitting here thinking, this was not the Sunday to come. Turns out this was not the Sunday to show up. Chris, you're not making me feel good about anything. That last song made me feel really good, and now I don't feel good at all. I feel very discouraged. Because again, this word sin, it carries this weight, this idea of of consequence, and there is a consequence to sin. This idea of condemnation, and make no mistake about it, it is connected to condemnation. But when Jesus steps into our story, Jesus does something remarkable. He talks frequently about sin, and he consistently calls people to the reality that they are sinners, but he does so for a different purpose. He does so for a different purpose. Because for Jesus, the recognition of the fact that you're a sinner wasn't about condemnation. It was actually about restoration. And so Jesus' purpose in talking about sin was actually restoration, not condemnation. Now he acknowledges the reality of sin and what it deserves and the nature of it and what it does to the world, but the entire time his purpose is restoration. And he doesn't mess around about sin. He's very straightforward with the understanding of sin, and he consistently calls it out, but as he's calling it out, he's constantly calling us back to the reality over and over again that God still loves you. You are a sinner, but God still loves you. God still loves you. God still loves you. And he does this in a really unique way because he does two things at the same time. One, he consistently raises the bar. He consistently calls people to a higher understanding, a bigger understanding, a greater understanding of what sin is and what it is that sin does. And the reality that no one escapes this, that we're all in this. This is one of the ways that I know when someone's actually read through the story of Jesus. Because sometimes people will say to me after a conversation and I've said something that's a little bit hard to hear, and they'll say to me, you know what, I just don't think that really fits with Jesus' teachings. Because Jesus was always, he was so nice. And I think to myself, you clearly have not read the story of Jesus. Because make no mistake about it, Jesus is always loving. Always loving. But sometimes being loving meant that he had to say things that didn't necessarily make people feel good.